This study contributes to a broader effort to reassess the historical accuracy of the Hebrew Bible, particularly where it intersects with Egyptian and Near Eastern chronologies. Rather than conforming the biblical account to existing models, it uses the biblical timeline as a guiding framework for interpreting key archaeological data and resolving long-standing chronological discrepancies. With the destruction of Jericho's walls and the establishment of the spiritual center at Shiloh, dated to the Middle Bronze Age, and 300 years later, the abandonment of Shiloh, dated to the Late Bronze Age, coinciding with the Habiru revolt described in the Amarna letters, the next step is to reconcile these archaeological events with the Bible's internal chronology. Archaeological evidence shows that the walls of Jericho at Tel Es Sultan, stratum 6, collapsed violently, and that the first major altar at Tel Shiloh, stratum 4, was erected around the same time. Both events typically dated to approximately 1600 BC. However, the Bible describes these events as directly being caused by Joshua while placing his conquest around 1400 BC. Likewise, the Habiru revolt under Libiah in the Amarna letters is dated to the reign of Akhenaten around 1300 BC, whereas the biblical rise of Saul is placed around 1100 BC. This study argues that the recurring 200 to 300 year discrepancy indicates the conventional timeline has been overstretched during the early Iron Age. As a result, these events of the Bronze Age are dated significantly earlier than their actual occurrence. Correcting this distortion allows the historical record to align more naturally with the biblical account. Accordingly, this research proposes a bold yet evidence-based solution. Egypt's timeline, from the end of the 20th dynasty to the rise of the 25th, coincides with the radiocarbon dating anomaly known as the Hallstatt Plateau, which this study identifies as an artificial distortion created to uphold a flawed modern chronology. Correcting this 200-year radiocarbon anomaly requires a corresponding adjustment to the Egyptian king list, a step that is both necessary and transformative, as it restores coherence to Egypt's fragmented historical record and allows key archaeological events to align meaningfully with the biblical timeline. The goal is not to reject existing models blindly, but to test whether realigning the Egyptian timeline can better match the biblical narrative while remaining consistent with archaeological and textual evidence. The traditional Egyptian chronology places the death of Ramses III around 1155 BCE and the rise of Psammetichus I in 664 BCE, creating a time span of about 491 years for what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, a long era of political instability and fragmented rule that goes beyond the number of pharaohs in the king list preserved by Manetho. However, this study suggests that those 491 years should be reduced to only 166 years. Egyptologists have long known that, in this period of fragmentation of the pharaonic power and decentralized rule, different pharaohs often ruled simultaneously in competing cities like Tanis, Thebes, Bubastis, and Sais, making the traditional one king at a time model misleading during periods of internal conflict. In this revised model, Ramses III's death is placed at 829 BC, while Psammetichus I's reign remains at 664 BC, compressing the period significantly but plausibly. This change doesn't rest on speculation alone. It builds on the idea that some Egyptian dynasties believed to have ruled one after another may have actually ruled at the same time in different parts of the country. One of the foundational points for this revised timeline comes from a clue at the Bubastite portal at Karnak, where year 5 of Pharaoh Shoshenq Thirst is linked to year 19 of an unnamed pharaoh, usually related from other sources to Susenes. Most scholars assume this unnamed ruler was Susenes VI, the last king of the 21st dynasty, placing Shoshenq Thirst after him. But this study offers a different reading, that the reference is actually to Susenes Thirst, an earlier king. This implies that Shoshenq I and Susenes IV ruled at the same time, and their dynasties, the 21st and 22nd, overlapped rather than followed each other. This reinterpretation alone shortens the timeline by 80 years and provides a precedent for identifying other overlaps during Egypt's fragmented eras. The other foundational point for this revised timeline re-examines three events in Egyptian history that are usually spread out over more than a century: the Nile River Revolt led by Pedubast and Uput, dated traditionally to 824 BCE, the Victory Stele of Piae, commemorating the Nubian conquest of Egypt, dated to 723 BCE, the rise of Tefnakht II in Sais, dated to 685 BC. Rather than viewing them as separate, unrelated events, this study proposes that all three occurred within a single 21-year period, described in the between 707 and 686 BCE. The argument suggests that many pharaohs not listed in the king list of Manetho, and commonly assigned to the century-long period between Pedubast revolt and the rise of Tefnakht, actually reigned as vassals during the prelude, ongoing, and aftermath of the Pedubast, Nubian, and Tefnakht rise, rather than within these dynasties during such a long span itself. Additionally, many pharaohs appear to have been duplicated to fill gaps in the timeline, such as the case of Uput and Uput II, also Pedubast and Pefnidabast, or yet of Tefnakht III and Tefnakht II, who were likely the same individuals. Therefore, the Piae Stele, often seen as a record of a single event marking the Nubians' triumph, is better understood as a composite account capturing the full scope of this turbulent period. The Piae Stele records the Nubian king Pi's campaign to reunify Egypt by subduing a series of rebellious local rulers and priests, known as Osorkon of Bubastis, Shoshenq of Busiris, Pefnedabast of Heracleopolis, Tefnakht of Sais, and many others. This study argues that the Piae Stele does not portray an isolated conflict between the 24th and 25th dynasties, but rather preserves a composite account of a broader power struggle involving figures from the 22nd, 23rd, and 26th dynasties. By examining regional attributions and name parallels, key individuals can be identified with historical pharaohs otherwise scattered across a fragmented timeline. Pefnedabast of Heracleopolis and Uput of Leontopolis are best identified as Pedubast and his son Uputthurs of the 23rd dynasty, who jointly attacked Osorkon III of the 22nd dynasty, known from the chronicles of Prince Osorkon. Shoshenq of Busiris corresponds to Shoshenq III, an ally of Osorkon III, confirming Busiris as his base and his eventual submission to Piae. His successor, Pami, appears as Pamai, preserving continuity in name and role. Nimlot of Hermopolis likely refers to Nimlot C, son of Osorkon III and high priest of Amun, whose mention anchors his role in the Nubian reconquest. Bakenranef, killed in the campaign, represents Pia's most decisive victory. Finally, Tefnakht I, mentioned in the stele, was later duplicated into Tefnakht II to fill the chronological gap between Nubian dominance and the rise of a dynasty that would overthrow his successors 3 generations later. These identifications challenge the traditional Egyptian king lists, but they make sense when we understand that the Piae Stele was written during a wartime environment, where rulers may have been identified by their military garrisons or active command zones, not by their peacetime capitals. The events, when seen together, offer a cohesive picture of civil war, shifting alliances, and foreign intervention, not a centuries-long decline, but a rapid and dramatic restructuring of Egyptian power. By reducing the Iron Age through the correction of the Hallstatt Plateau and this careful reorganization of the pharaoh's king list, this study shows that the destruction of Jericho's walls and the Shiloh altar, both dated to 1600 BC, align seamlessly with the biblical timeline of Joshua's conquest around 1400 BC. This revised chronology brings new clarity to one of the murkiest periods in Egyptian history, and opens up the possibility that the biblical record and the archaeological record may be far more compatible than previously thought.